Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore Presents. This month, I'm chatting to Professor Kimberly Lau, who's a professor of literature at the University of California in Santa Cruz. She's the author of Erotic Infidelities, Love and Enchantment in Angela Carter's The Bloody Chamber, Body Language, Sisters in Shape, Black Women's Fitness and Feminist Identity Politics, and New Age Capitalism, Making Money East of Eden, as well as articles in a number of interdisciplinary journals. Her research interests include fairy tales, folklore and fantasy, feminist theory and critical race studies, and the intersection of popular and political cultures. In this chat, we'll be talking about her new book, Specters of the Marvellous, Race and the Development of the European Fairy Tale, and the ways in which racist tropes and stereotypes are embedded in European fairy tales from France, Italy, Germany, and Great Britain. Enjoy. Hello, and welcome to Fabulous Folklore. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, and thank you so much for inviting me to join you.
It's absolutely fine. Obviously, I've already mentioned your book, Specters of the Marvellous, in the introduction. And I think because it's about fairy tales, we'll start with a really horrible question. How do you define a fairy tale?
Oh, that's a hard question. And as you know, in the book, I waffle a little bit about that. But, um, you know, in many ways, like many genres, it's one of these things that people feel like we know it when we see it, but we can't actually define it. As people have said about pornography. Also, as you may know, I believe that was in the US Supreme Court ruling, actually. But I think of the fairy tale as a magical tale, in which magic in the world is taken for granted. It's not set apart as something noticeable. It's just a part of the quotidian world. And then, in the European context, I often think of the rise tale, right? The sort of rags to riches, often ending in a marriage. Although I often also include what some people might consider folk tales. Red Riding Hood, for instance, that doesn't have most of those kinds of magical elements. Well, I mean, you have a talking wolf, I guess that's magical, but you don't have so much of the rise tale or the marriage or that going off on a quest, which I think are some of the main features that we tend to think of. But I think of fairy tale and folk tale as pretty interlocked, because of the way they've been worked in the tradition. And then I also don't really make a big distinction between this is a literary tale only or this is an oral tale only, because I think over the historical record, we see that movement back and forth a great deal. So someone may tell a tale and then it gets written down and circulated, and then someone has read it or heard it and then performs it for another audience. So the oral literary binary to me is not that productive.
Hmm. So, how would you describe your book to people who are new to it, and what actually prompted you to write it?
That's a great question. I really like to think of this book as a close study of the genealogy of the sort of canonical fairy tale collections, European fairy tale collections, in relationship to the politics of race, the ways that people were thinking about race and imperialism and colonialism in very specific historical contexts. And then I am interested in showing how those ideas about race, how that kind of racial thinking influenced the fairy tale as a genre, actually influenced its development. So I think a lot of people read this book as an expose of racism in fairy tales, which it certainly is, but that's not my goal, is not just to say like these tales are racist from our 21st century perspective, but to go back to the early 17th century where I start in that Neapolitan collection by Basile to really say, this is how people were thinking about race of the time, and look at how it has shaped what we consider some of the first written fairy tales in Europe. And then we can trace some of those tropes across time and really see how racial thinking has kind of, in my opinion, sort of driven the fairy tale in a lot of ways. And so to answer your other question, how did I get interested in this idea? There's this tale by Madame d'Aulnoy, so late 17th century France, and it's about it's called The Bee and the Orange Tree, and it's about a young princess who gets lost at sea when they're out with her family. She washes up on shore and she's taken in by ogres. And this family of ogres typically would eat humans, but they take to her as as a foundling sort of, and they bring her into their home and she learns their language and all of these things. And it just, when I was teaching this in a graduate seminar, it just was so odd to me. It just felt like a colonial narrative. And then her cousin, who she has never seen before, also is in a shipwreck when she's much older and washes up on shore and they fall in love. He recognizes her. And then all of a sudden, the ogres become other sort of immediately. So there's this real sort of colonial tension. And she is also, I should say, betrothed to one of the ogre sons. So this tale was so odd to me. And it just felt like it was driven by colonial ideas and by race. And so I started there and started digging into the French material, which was the first part that I wrote.
Yeah. So I get the feeling that this isn't really a perspective many people will have followed before, because obviously there's all like the feminist retellings and things like that. So is this something that people have maybe overlooked before? Is it things people haven't wanted to see maybe? Or is it just that now is the right sort of time for people to actually reimagine or not reimagine, reinvestigate these tales?
That's such a great question. I would love to hear what you think as someone who's studied a lot of folklore, even in school. I think the world of the European fairy tale is so white, right? Like when we close our eyes, and from the beginning of the book, my introduction is basically asking people to close your eyes and picture yourself in a fairy tale world. What do you see? And is one of the things that you see the fact that everybody is white, right? Like just our cultural imaginary of the world of the fairy tale is white. And so I think people haven't been that motivated to read race into it. Whereas, as you said, we have so many feminist analyses, really great ones, as well as really great feminist adaptations. The sexism is right on the surface of the fairy tale world, right? It's almost impossible to ignore it. Even as a kid, you can sort of pick up on some of these things. And so I think, and the class is also right on the surface, right? They're both often directly thematized. So I think it makes sense that we have a long tradition of that kind of critical analysis. And because the world is so white, I think it's really it just hasn't been at the forefront of people's minds. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's also one of those things. As I was reading them, I thought because we've now got a lot of sort of collections by other authors, it's almost like there's something to compare them with now. Whereas previously, the Gas Wars were often maybe held as not the gold standard, but like the ones that people would know.
Hmm.
Whereas obviously because there's so many collections, and obviously you mentioned some of them in the conclusion that you think, well, now we can actually compare them and go, oh, hang on, there's a problem here. Um, which I guess is why it's quite interesting to look at them from that perspective.
Yes, and I think some of those adaptations or retellings are fantastic. You know, Helen Oyoyemi has written several what I think of as fairy tale novels. The book by Bola Babalola is really excellent. The sort of love and color about a whole different orientation of the world that's not called called out, right? It's just, this is the world, this is my world. And it's a very much more accurate kind of cultural world than the world that the Langs imagined, for instance, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I was really pleased to see you include that collection because it is so good, Bolu's collection. And I think what I was wondering is, do you think that collections like that actually can bring some hope that fairy tales can actually focus on the magic and wonder and not sort of this white supremacist agenda? Is that kind of a nice view forwards to the future, do you think?
I do think so. I think there's some wonderful retellings. And in the same way that for me, the way that I got interested in fairy tales was actually through Angela Carter's short stories, her collection, The Bloody Chamber. Like I was like you. I didn't read a ton of fairy tales as a kid. It wasn't my world or the thing I always loved, and so therefore I wanted to study it. But I fell in love with with Angela Carter's stories. And then I needed to understand a lot more what she riffing on, right? And so that kind of opened up this big fairy tale world for me. And of course, even before Carter, of course, but I think of Carter's collection as like a watershed feminist collection. Between that time and now, we've just had tons and tons of feminist rewritings and adaptations, not only in literature, but also in film and other media. I think that what people like Bolu Babalola and Helen Oyoyemi and Nalo Hopkinson and Catherine Valente, I think the work that they're doing could have that same effect, right? It could bring people to the fairy tale, to the European tradition, but maybe already provide them with a different lens through which to read those stories. Yeah.
Yeah. I was fascinated as well because, like I said before we started recording, I think the only one I was really familiar with was the collection by the Brothers Grimm, and some of them are really unpleasant. And I was aware of the other ones. Well, apart from the Langs, I was aware of the German or the Italian and the French collections by name. Um, but of all of them, I think the one that caught my attention the most was the I'm going to mangle our pronunciation because me and French don't get on. Is it Dalnois?
Dolnois, yeah.
Dalnois. And the fact that she um was sort of engaging with the idea of like a French Empire through her stories. So are many of her stories still quite well known now? So would the listeners know what they are, or has she sort of been forgotten a little bit?
She definitely has been forgotten, or her tales, they're much more elaborate and they're longer and they're not written in the style of the folk, right? So even though like Charles Perrault also published tales at the same time, he wrote them in the what he thought was the voice of the old granny who would be telling tales. Um, and so because of that, they, I think, sort of felt they were really part of the canon and very, very popular from the time of their first publication um, through parts of the 19th, I would say maybe even through the 19th century. And then they really kind of disappeared, and we have the rise of the Grimms as kind of the way that we understand the fairy tale. And Perrault fits into that. But as some of her tales really continue to be known, I think, like The White Cat is one of her most famous tales, um, and that was reproduced in the Lang series. And I feel like a couple of her other tales were reproduced in the Lang series. And then within fairy tale studies, certainly many people have been studying her work and kind of bringing it back, if you will. But I think just if you went out on the street and talked to an average person and said, "Have you heard of the Grimms? Do you know the fairy tales of the Brothers Grimm?" They would probably say yes. And if you said, "Do you know the fairy tales of Madame Dolnois?" They probably wouldn't, right? Yeah.
So were her stories at the time then, because you mentioned about the way that obviously there is this engagement with empire, was she actually embraced by the regime to help support colonial efforts? Or is it one of those kind of things where maybe she wasn't actually acknowledged at the time in much the same way she's not acknowledged now?
I think that's a great question, and I definitely have some fairy tale studies colleagues who could probably answer it in better ways than I can. But at the same time, there was she was part of women's, but I would say kind of feminist salon society, and that's where they were often sharing their tales with each other. And part of salon society emerged as a response to an increasingly conservative set of policies and laws around women in particular, removing some of their rights, giving a lot of rights to men in relationship to marriage. So if a woman, a wife, was accused, for instance, of adultery, she could be sent to a convent basically for the rest of her life by her husband, just on the word of her husband. So it was an increasingly conservative time for women. And so most of the uh, historical work that I know of really addresses how Daunoise and other feminist salonières of the time were working against some of that through their tales. And so I think because they were in this relatively elite kind of feminist circle, they weren't necessarily taken up by the ruling authorities of France. But they were incredibly popular. There was a huge vogue for fairy tales of the time. And Daunoise herself was also an incredibly popular travel writer. And so I think that's the kind of argument that I'm making, that her tales weren't necessarily deployed for specific political purposes, but they certainly are resonant with a lot of those political aims of the time.
Yeah. So who would have, I'm assuming then children wouldn't have been her intended audience, or were they?
I think that the intended audience was really the social circle of the salon. So they would write these and then read them to each other. And that's where you can really see sort of the coded feminist resistance to some of the emerging conservative laws and just social mores of the time. Children probably learned them secondhand, by people having heard them and then maybe performing parts of them or telling parts of them with children, or possibly even reading parts of them to children. But they're pretty literary, versus when you see the Grimms, which is really edited and written for children specifically. These were not so much.
Right. So obviously mentioning the Grimms, because I mean, they're so problematic on so many levels. I suppose my other sort of question, I've got lots of questions, but you know what I mean. My thought on them is, so the Grimms were obviously collecting stories that they sort of found, and obviously with their idea of trying to find this like shared Germanic identity. So is there any way we can ever know what the stories were like before they got their hands on them? Because I know you mentioned that the author of the really anti-Semitic one, because obviously it feels like you've got to differentiate between how awful they are. Also has a version where it's actually a monk that the bad guy in the story. So do we know that the original versions maybe might have been more diverse, or would they have actually just been as bad, do you think?
I think that that's a really great question. And I think we would have to do a lot of archival research. The 19th century obviously was this time when people were really collecting tales from what they thought were sort of purely oral sources, even though we know that there was that movement of oral literary back and forth. Um, so there is some of that archival record. And then with the Grimms, there's been great scholarship done where they've looked at the handwritten manuscript from 1910 and or sorry, 1810, compared that with the 1812 for publication of the first version, and then continue to compare the versions until the seventh edition. And you can really see over that time how much progressively anti-Semitic some of them became, I think. And Ruth Bodegheimer has done excellent work on really drawing out the anti-Semitic edits that they made to the explicitly anti-Semitic tales. And as you said, you kind of have to differentiate between the ones that are like on the surface, just purely anti-Semitic, and then some of the ones where it's probably more coded or more implicit, or maybe I'm just interpreting them that way. But I feel like we see that difference there. So certainly we know from collections and archives that people told that tale, The Jew and the Thorn Bush, with a monk as the character who's made Jewish in this version. And in fact, that's quite a popular version with the monk. But I don't know. I think, some folklorists are interested in trying to trace these sources to their or form, but it feels a little bit like an impossible task, to really know. But we do know certainly that in oral tradition, tales were told with different kinds of figures inhabiting some of the same roles.
Yeah, I suppose if you found different versions, you'd be able to kind of find out who the boogeyman was, I guess, of a particular group. Because I guess in some places it might be like a judge or something, and yeah, it would be more of a role rather than anything else. And I think this is the thing, like with the Grimms then doing their stories for children, I almost feel like that makes their inclusion of like racist and anti-Semitic messaging worse. In a way, like it's bad that it's in the other ones, but I think it's because of the transmission of them to impressionable people, and obviously children and so on. Who don't have that um level of discernment and so on is sort of the I don't want to keep using the word problematic around the Grimms, but it's so easy to do. Um, but do you think it's easier for people to situate the Grimms in that kind of nationalistic context, sort of given that drive for unification in the 19th century? Or is it one of those things where it's just so blatant that you kind of can't miss it?
In the
Yeah.
anti-Semitism
Yeah.
and um, so in their collection there are three explicitly anti-Semitic tales. So those I think it would be impossible to miss, in my opinion. Um, one of them is interesting. It trades in a lot of anti-Semitic stereotypes and beliefs, but it doesn't punish the Jewish character in the same way that the other two very explicit anti-Semitic tales do. So it's a little bit more complicated, I should just say that. Um, the reason why anti-Semitism in the Grimms is so important for me in relationship to race is because I think anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism were really like integrated in that historical moment, especially. And I give the example of this um, late 18th century thinker who Michaelis, who believed that Germany should just create these sugar islands, basically like go and colonize some islands, because then you could deport Jews to those islands. So you would be solving all these problems at once, right? You would be removing Jews from your society. You would have colonies that produce sugar, which was a big expensive commodity that Germany was dependent on other European powers for at the time. Um, so I think of anti-Semitism in its most blatant, explicit form in the book as kind of a paradigm to help us read and understand the anti-Black racism because I think they're connected. So I don't know if that gets at your question exactly, but
Yeah, I think so. And I think one of the things that sort of strikes me thinking about these particular fairy tales is obviously thinking how a lot of people will have come into contact with them now through things like Disney.
mhm.
Can't really avoid that one. And I think we saw a lot of that with the live action version of The Little Mermaid when everyone kicked off when Halle Bailey was sort of cast as Ariel. And you think, well, really, like, can she sing? Yes. Can she open her eyes underwater? Yes. She's qualified, you know. Um, so I think do you think that's part of the latent problem that we saw there, that people have this idea that fairy tales should be white? Or was that also like a lack of awareness, do you think, from people who didn't realize that, for example, mermaids are in all cultures and there's some really, really impressive ones in Africa, like Mami Wata? Is that like a lack of awareness on people's part, or is it just Disney brainwashing?
I think people around the Disney films and then the live action. And we're seeing this with Snow White also because, they're about to release Snow White finally. And Rachel Zegler is cast as Snow White and she's has a Colombian background. And so, there's a lot of online ugly chatter about how she's not white enough in exactly the same way that Halle Bailey. But a lot of the things that people are saying online when they're so upset about these castings is that like Disney is, just being woke or doing this DEI thing for the bottom line and they're ruining the classics, right? So they imagine tradition and the classic fairy tales and um, authenticity of those tales as being white. And nowhere in, well, I guess in Snow White, in the Grimm's version, she's described as having skin as white as snow and the blood prick and the window frame. So that's her coloring. But in Anderson's Little Mermaid, we don't, it never says that she's white, right? So like it's just not there. And I think that speaks really to how deeply people just imagine the fairy tale world as white. It's just unquestioned. And then to leverage all of this idea of tradition, the authentic version, the classic version has to be white. I just think that's where those are such telling examples, right?
Mm.
Yeah.
It was also very telling, I think, that that was the thing people had a problem with, not the actual change from the original ending of the Little Mermaid sort of
Oh,
story. And you think, ooh, if Disney had done that version, that would have been a very different film. And it was like they were almost focusing on the wrong part. And you're like, well, just wait and see what the film's like.
absolutely. And I think for many people, I think Disney's version of The Little Mermaid is probably what they think of as the classic, authentic story of The Little Mermaid, even though, as you're making clear, the story has a terribly different, horribly sad ending, right? Where she turns into sea foam. I mean, it's just tragic. The prince doesn't love her. He treats her as a pet. She kind of sleeps curled up on the doormat or by the door. And it's just a very different story before it's Disneyfied. But then people still, when they're talking about the casting or the hashtag not my mermaid, etc., really invested in Disney as the classic, authentic version, with maybe not even knowing the Anderson version. Yeah.
I suppose the other one that would probably apply, it would be, and I know obviously we've not had the same thing with the live action version, but like Beauty and the Beast. And I hadn't realized there was two versions of it before Disney got their hands on it. Um, how sort of surprised do you think people would be to hear what the actual tales were like if they'd only ever seen the Disney film? And could you give like a quick summary of the main sort of differences between the Beauty and the Beast sort of original stories and the Disney version?
Sure. I think it I like to read the tail type, the Beauty and the Beast tail type, which is also the Cupid and Psyche tail type. I like to read that as having at least its literary origins in the Basile collection, where we have two tales, the Golden Trunk and the Padlock. And they're both tales in which what we know today as the Beast character was a handsome black slave, right? So we have the sort of, I don't know if it's the origin, but it's kind of one of the literary origins of this tale that then transforms itself over time. So by the time we get to animal bridegroom tales that follow the same storyline in late 17th century France, there's a a wild boar character, for instance. And he and the protagonist actually have sex, and then she becomes pregnant, but they don't know that he's becoming a man every night, right? They think he's both the Prince Marquessan, the wild boar, and the woman that he married, they both think he's still a boar at night. So there's definitely this miscegenation that's happening, right? And this, of course, would not continue in the Grimms or in Disney or anything like that. Then in the middle of the 18th century, we have the two versions that really we know the most about today. So there was a Villeneuve from like 1740, and that version is just a long novella version of the one that we kind of end up with Beaumont, but it's set specifically in a collection that Villeneuve wrote with one or two other tales, and it has a frame tale about the daughter of a plantation owner on Saint-Domingue who has sent his daughter to France to be educated. And now she's betrothed, so he's having her shipped back to Saint-Domingue, which is basically Haiti today. And the nurse who is her chaperone is telling them stories to pass the time on the ship. And she tells this Beauty and the Beast story. So I think it's impossible not to understand the Beauty and the Beast, the first like really elaborated literary version that we know of, as being deeply integrated with ideas about French colonialism. And also, we've now shifted from New Canada or the New World at the end of the 17th century, where there was this belief in the noble savage could be assimilated. In some cases, miscegenation was actually encouraged as part of a civilizing thing. So that it kind of makes sense that this boar and this woman would sleep together and she would get pregnant. By the time we get to the Caribbean in the middle of the 18th century, we're now looking at African slaves, right? Completely different French ideas about the possibility of assimilation, about just just a completely different racialization, right? So in that Villeneuve novella, nothing even close to sexual happens until he becomes a man, until he's disenchanted and becomes a man. And then the version that we all probably know best is by Beaumont, which was maybe about 15 years after the Villeneuve. And that also has racial connotations very clearly, because in the magazine where she published this, she has, after all of her tales, the students and the teacher kind of having a dialogue. And the one that frames the Beauty and the Beast story has the pupil in the dialogue saying, "Oh, yes, that beast reminds me of my dad's black boy who drives me around sometimes," or something. It's the equivalency between the beast and the black person is made very clear. So that, of course, is completely metaphorized in Disney's version of Beauty and the Beast. But I think Disney does really draw on the Beaumont version. So we see the curse being about looks and knowing what's on the inside versus the outside, and some of those features, the magical elements around the house to help serve Beauty while she's there and things like that. But what was at one time very explicitly race characterizations are completely metaphorized by the time we get to the Beast, Beauty
Mm.
and the Beast in Disney.
I remember seeing a meme that someone did a little while ago, and it was about the animated version rather than the live action one. And they were saying how, the bit at the end of the film when the beast turns back into the prince, and how there's almost like a fleeting expression of disappointment on Belle's face when she sees him as a human. And I think that's actually quite interesting in that context. And yeah, it's a weird story.
I know
So
that I remember that scene so much, and when I teach that film, and I also teach Shrek, um, I I do think that the audience also is disappointed, right? There's something about seeing the young woman, the beautiful princess, with the beast that appeals to many people, right? So there's not really much story after that. So I think that's also one of the things that people really like about Shrek. So when they're both become ogres, it doesn't have quite the same feel. It's not as disappointing as the Disney version, but it's still not, there's something about this kind of like desire that can't happen that I think is appealing to people on some level.
mm. I must admit, I always find the Shrek films really strange because I think is it the fourth one where it's like the riff on It's a Wonderful Life. And when you see Fiona's life without Shrek, it's just like leaving the resistance and having this amazing existence. And you're like, oh, I don't think that's the message you were really hoping to go for there, DreamWorks.
I didn't even know there was a fourth one. Uh, have I even seen the third one is kind of the Arthurian
Yeah.
legend one, I think, right? So I think I've seen through those, but I didn't even know there was a fourth one where Fiona's a feminist liberationist. That's awesome. I'll have to check that out.
It's worth seeing just for that more than anything else. But yeah, it's very much Shrek has his whole like, George Bailey, I wish I'd never been born moment, and then it's kind of what happens as a result of that. And yeah, it's a bit schmaltzy.
And it does seem to miss the mark if,
Yes.
she could have had this exciting, adventurous, important life.
Yeah, it is quite funny, and you watch it and go, it's interesting, but never mind. Um, I think the one of the things I was curious about while I was reading the book was obviously the collections are predominantly like France, Italy, Germany, and Britain. And I was thinking, is there an American corpus of fairy tales, or are they just translations of the European stories?
That's really a great question. I wouldn't say I don't know of anything that rises to the same sort of canonical status. And I think um, all my colleagues and peers that I know who grew up loving fairy tales, they either read translations of the Brothers Grimm's or the Andrew Lang series, some of the books in the Andrew Lang series. And then beginning in the late 1930s, I would say Disney animated films are probably the closest we have to an American kind of collection. And they really do set the foundation, I think, for what a lot of Americans think of when they think of fairy tales. And I think that's what they default to, as if those are the authentic, sort of only versions.
Mm. Yeah, because when I was thinking of that, all I could think of were like the Gothic authors, like Edgar Allan Poe, and I'm like, I don't think that's the right direction.
And not quite, probably. I think there are, one of my first fairy tale um, teachers, he, for his dissertation, I believe, collected native tales and did some structural analysis and some indexing. So certainly we obviously have long traditions of native tales. Some of them are sacred and so wouldn't be shared with outsiders. And I don't know that any have been collected in such a way that it really feels like this is an American corpus that people would refer to or know about. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. I know I suppose it's been really cool to see the work that Helen Inday's been doing with the Mythological Africans platform that she runs on Substack now. It used to be Twitter, formerly of X or whatever it is now. And she put out a collection on Kickstarter. It was The Runaway Princess and Other Stories, and she collected all these tales from all over Africa. And it was really cool because you could just read them and enjoy them rather than having to go, is this the African Bluebeard? Or you just read them and go, yeah, this is a really cool story.
Oh, that's great. I'd love to get that collection. Just the name of it from me. What's it called again? The Runaway
The
Princess?
Runaway Princess and Other Stories, yeah.
Okay.
I'll send you the details. It's really good. I mean, Helen's lovely anyway, and she's done really good work on collecting all these stories from different parts of Africa. And I know there's a couple of podcasts, because the Afro Tales podcast as well. I'm on the host explicitly looks for stories from like the diaspora, but also Africa as well. And I think it's if you come to it from a folklore point of view, you can just kind of listen to the stories and go, wow, these are really cool. But the minute someone tacks on fairy tales, everyone kind of immediately goes, "Oh, it's not like the Grimms. It's not like Hans Christian Andersen." So there's a weird framing thing
Hmm.
there, which I'm not quite sure what that's all about.
I do think that the I really feel like Andrew Lang in many ways in this 12 volume colored fairy book series, the way that he frames the fairy tale. I mean, there's Greek myths in there. There's all sorts of stuff. There's native tales that were collected by missionaries or early anthropologists, and he just brings them all together under the umbrella of the fairy tale. And I think that is what's really, in some ways, set us up to disregard other native traditions, storytelling traditions that are rich, like you're saying, in their own right, obviously, but also don't have to be forced into this genre of the fairy tale, right? It might be like some kind of wonder tale that we don't even have a name for. So I feel like he's really done, I mean, you read my book, so you know that chapter. I'm really reading him in relation to British imperialism, but I feel like he did this real epistemological imperialism too with the fairy tale and really made it something that we now have to decolonize, that we have to decouple from this European formation in order to even appreciate, much less begin to understand some of these African tales or Indian tales or tales where we don't, or I don't easily know the cultural context. I don't know the traditions. I don't know when they would be told, etc. So yeah, I think he did a lot of damage there with those colored fairy books.
So, is there anything that we can take from these particular tales and these collections? Perhaps maybe looking at them from like the prevailing attitudes of their time, so looking at them maybe more from like a socio-political point of view, or do you think we should just retire them now and just let them be and move on from them?
I I certainly am an advocate of never letting go of history because I think it's really dangerous. I mean, here in the US, many people just don't want to, they're sort of like, okay, that was our racist past, so we're just going to lop that off and we're going to move forward in a progressive way. I mean, obviously we're having a backlash to that at the moment, but I also don't think that's the wisest strategy, right? I think we need to remember that we had this really troubling, violent, racist past. And hopefully we're a little bit better now, but not necessarily. And so I would never say just forget all those tales. I would say hopefully read them with a different lens and maybe talk about them with others with a different lens in the same way that we've done with feminism, right? With all that critical analysis. Now it's impossible to read. I can't think of any tale I could read without automatically kind of bringing a feminist lens to it. And I hope in some ways that people get to a point where they can't read some of these tales without seeing some of the sort of racial thinking that's embedded in them, that's kind of driving the tale in some ways, but in much more invisible ways, I think, than the gender ideologies.
Hmm. So obviously, bearing in mind how awful some of these descriptions actually are in these books or the stories collections, how did you actually stand reading them all so closely? Was it the kind of thing where you feel like you needed like a good bath after reading them, or is it just because it's like your professional area, you can maintain that distance from them?
It's kind of like, the Kristeva objection, like you don't want to look, but you have to look, you're just so I would read them and I read all the collections multiple times start to finish, like to try to sit down and read the Grimm's start to it's just I mean just some of the stories are just so boring and so but so when I would get to these ones that really did have this anti-Semitism or this Orientalism or racism, I would be kind of excited like, oh, this idea that I have, like I think it's not just my reading that I'm going to force on here, like there is a lot of evidence here, so I'd get really excited. So I think I read them all through a critical lens, which made it so much more palatable because I was like, oh, more evidence, So I think that made it much easier. I had never read all the collections start to finish before that. It's just unbearable to me because it's such a formulaic genre as well. So you're just reading the same thing over and over. So having that way of thinking about it and kind of being on a treasure hunt as I was reading it made it a lot more enjoyable, I guess.
Mm. And I think the last thing I was wondering was obviously you talk in the introduction about how these kind of stories are seen as like universal and how people will try and pick out those stories from other parts of the world as well and go, oh look, it's their version of that, which is pointless because it's taken the context out of the equation. So do you think because every time somebody writes a story down that's oral or translates something and they always are going to influence the end result, can we ever take fairy tales to be universal in scope? Or is it the idea of storytelling is universal, but then the type of story is what differs?
I would definitely say storytelling is universal. I mean, I don't know for sure, but it's hard to imagine any culture that doesn't have some kind of storytelling narrative tradition. So I would go out on a limb without knowing for sure and say storytelling is very likely to be universal. Um, I don't think the European fairy tale in the way that we think about it and the way that it's been kind of more or less defined is universal by any stretch, right? So I think our work is to decolonize that idea and then to go honor these other genres of storytelling and really try to understand them in their particular context and not necessarily in relation to the European version of that tale, which many people have done. Yeah.
I think it is interesting because there's a writer I follow on Instagram, and I've got one of his collections from Japan called Kyoto Court. And one of the things I like about his collections is he tells you the story, but then he gives you the historical context to go with it, so you can kind of go, oh, okay, cool. And I think that is such an interesting way of approaching it, where obviously even I would imagine people who are familiar with the stories might not necessarily realize where they came from, but it also then reminds you, no, this story comes from this context. You can't really take one from the other.
I think that's great. That sounds like a great model for an anthology. I mean, because like you're saying, and many of these tales were collected and, 200 years ago. And so, of course, we have to know the historical context, I think, and can't just assume that they have enduring meaning, right? Yeah.
Cool. So obviously this is your current book, and you've obviously written other ones. Do you know what you'll be working on next?
I don't know. I've been working on, I do a little bit on monster studies, and I've really been, uh, I have an article called Monstrous Longings, a Twilight Postmortem. And I basically look at how the popularity of Twilight was an anticipation of the rise of Trump and MAGA and the January 6th insurrection, in the way that it was like a desire for return of the white patriarch back to the center of society. So I've been thinking a lot about monsters and the way that monster studies has done such a great job of making monsters really cool. Like monsters are definitely the hipsters, and we have all of the stories told from their perspectives. But I'm toying with this question of what would it mean to theorize monster studies with sort of white heteropatriarchy at the center. And I think that, yeah, that's just something that I want to play with. I think we see the rise right now of kind of bro culture or the manosphere as it's being called, and obviously the elections in our country really speak to that, but I think it's more of a global phenomenon as well. The Pellico rape case in France, right, which is like all of these men, not men in power, just everyday men raping this woman who was clearly unconscious. That there's I'm worried that in the way that we've made monsters really cool and hip, that we've maybe evacuated some of the power of monstrosity and our ability to think critically about who monsters are amongst us. And so that's sort of what I'm thinking about the most and working on right now. Yeah.
I wonder if true crime would help to sort of redress that balance of kind of reminding people that like monsters live next door.
Right, exactly. And that we don't want to lose our ability to say this is truly frightening, right? That these people, that rape case in France, I mean, that is frightening that your husband could be doing that to you, like your most intimate person that you trust so deeply, and I think in the US, there's a slogan among some men that became very popular, kind of a rallying cry around Trump and after the election. And it's your body, my choice. And that just is so scary to me. And so I really want to think about how these things that we don't lose sight of what's monstrous at the very center of our culture and not just recuperate and reclaim and celebrate the kind of monsters that have been pushed out and made monstrous over time, right? Like, I think that's definitely a good, worthwhile project, and I'm glad we've done that. But let's reckon now with the monsters kind of at our heart, yeah, that's where I am.
So can people find you anywhere online if they'd like to come and have a chat about any of these kind of issues?
Sure. My webpage is kimberlyjlau.com. You can message me through that. has my email address, and that's the best way. I'm not really on social media, so I'm not, I feel like a little bit too old of a dog for that new trick. But yes, I would love any conversation that anyone would like to have, and several things are linked from my webpage as well, and all my articles are there too.
Cool.
Yeah,
Because I know I've got quite a few sort of Gothic studies people who I'm sure would have gone, monsters, yes, at the end there. So at least if they want to get in touch, they can.
that'd be great. That's fantastic. I'd love to hear from anybody. Yes.
Cool. Well, it's been lovely talking to you.
You too. Thanks so much, Icy. I really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure.
Okay, I'll talk with you soon. Bye.
Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record, and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee, or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles, and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.